We're looking at some of the radical teachings of Jesus from the Gospel of Matthew, and perhaps none has been more radical, more life-changing, more symbolic of what Christ represented and what his mission and message represented than the Sermon on the Mount. Now, having said that, there is a lot of confusion surrounding the Sermon on the Mount at times, even among scholars. I can remember some of my Bible training years, different groups of people understand it differently, and some would say, oh, well, this really isn't meant for us. This was before Jesus' death and resurrection, so somehow this is kind of like the Old Testament in some way. It's not really, and I see some of the looks on your faces, it's like, well, how do you figure that? And I won't go into all the reasons for that here this morning, why some would have that point of view. But even coming at the Sermon on the Mount with open hearts and trying to understand, we still run into some real challenges. There's some really strong statements here, and to just try to understand what exactly is going on. The Beatitudes, that I think has a little bit more of a comforting feel to that section. And we looked at that 2 weeks ago, and we see God affirming those who are perhaps at the margins of life, or those who are powerless in other ways, those whom the world would say really are unlucky. And God, through Christ, is kind of turning things upside down and saying, no, you've got it all wrong. How blessed, how fortunate. What cause for joy if you find yourself among those who are poor in spirit, among those who have occasion to mourn, among those who are truly meek and humble, among those who seek justice for other people, who seek righteousness in their own lives, among those who have a heart to show mercy to others, among those who are the pure in heart, among those who seek peace, and so on. And so we hear that, and we hear kind of a fresh message to the law of the Old Testament. And we find some hope within us, perhaps, that okay, maybe it's not just about rules, but maybe it's about the heart in a way that I can get my mind around, and maybe this is someone I can follow and really believe in. But then we come down a few verses later, and where we really start today, verse 17, and Jesus said, now don't misunderstand why I've come. I did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. And you can almost feel collectively this disappointment among the crowd. Well, we really thought that's where he was heading. And now not only does he say, don't get me wrong, I've not come to throw the rules out, but he says, now let me tell you what the rules really mean. And it's kind of mindful of, I look back to the Old Testament story of the Israelites in slavery in Egypt. And you remember as Moses is talking to Pharaoh, and somewhere in that story, and I should have researched it so I could tell it correctly this morning, but there's a time when something was asked of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said, oh, well, obviously you have extra time on your hands. It was Moses saying, can we just go into the wilderness to worship for a few days and then we'll come back? And he says, well, obviously you've got extra time on your hand, so you know what? Now, instead of me supplying you with straw for you to meet your quota of bricks, you've got to get the straw too. And so what ended up happening was the law, the demands of the law became extra burdensome. And I want to suggest that there's a sense, if we read what Christ is saying, the passage we're about to look at, and we've read some of that together, you have heard it was said, but I tell you. And we see where the law says you shall not commit murder, and Jesus says, but what I'm telling you is you may not even have anger in your heart towards someone else. all of a sudden it's kind of like Pharaoh saying, okay, now you've got to get the straw too to make the same amount of bricks. And it's like, what happened to the affirming nature of the Beatitudes? Well, I want to suggest that there's not a disconnect there. On the one hand, God has the right to do both. And there may be a sense in which he's doing both here. And I've shared this before, but in some ways this could kind of give some credibility to the old adage of a pastor's responsibility in preaching, to bring comfort to the afflicted and to bring affliction to the comfortable. Okay, think about that for a moment. I've heard that many times. Part of my goal in preaching is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. We understand the first part real easily. When I'm struggling, when I'm going through difficult times, we want a word of comfort. But often we sit here and we're complacent. We're too comfortable. And God has ways of trying to stir us up a little bit, trying to agitate a little bit, trying to make us uncomfortable. Not to be mean to us, but for our own growth, for us to be able to recognize things that maybe we become complacent with in our lives, to recognize attitudes and perspectives that we've never seen before. And so God always wants to challenge us and to help to open our eyes and to know more of his heart and to see more of how far we fall from where he would want us to be. Not just as a demanding God, but for our good and for the good of all people as we grow into who he created us to be. So while we might on the one hand say, well, yes, the Beatitudes is the comfort for the afflicted, and then what follows is the affliction for the comfortable, for the self-righteous, kind of putting them in their place. And even though there's a little bit of that, I think we still miss something of a continuity here. And I want to suggest that the real continuity all the way through, not only through the Sermon on the Mount, but through all the teachings of Christ, the single thread is that God cares about the heart. God cares about the heart. And it's a message that would call us not to be looking at everybody else and pointing our finger. This section that we're gonna hurry through in just a moment is not there to give us more ammunition with which to judge other people. It's there to agitate us a little bit as we examine our own hearts. It's there to help us understand more of what God really longs for us and from us in our lives. And I think the Beatitudes and this section that follows really do fit together. I think the section that follows helps us understand more of what God is saying in the Beatitudes. And I think the Beatitudes help us understand a little bit more of what follows. It's as though Jesus said, okay, I've told you who's lucky in this world. I've told you who's to be envied. I've told you who's really most fortunate. The people whose hearts are like this, whose hearts are broken before me, whose hearts are sensitive to the needs of others, whose hearts know how to mourn and grieve, whose hearts long to make peace in this world, whose hearts are pure. And the list goes on and on. He says, now let me tell you what that looks like in a practical sense. And so we're going to find these different topics. And there's kind of a cadence as we move through the rest of this chapter 5. Often he starts by saying, you have heard it said, but I'm telling you. So there's a correction there. Or there's a deeper teaching about what the law really was meant. So each topic is introduced in that way, and then Jesus gives the correction or gives the deeper understanding. And then in most cases, just in case we kind of missed his point, he goes a step further with even something even more radical. Kind of a closing argument for that particular topic. In case you're not taking me seriously, let me say this. Or in case you didn't get my point, let me take it a step further. And as we look at all of these, I want us to be thinking of again, not adding to the law, not adding even more rules. Sometimes we want to look at it that way. But rather, what does that say about what God wants for the heart? It's interesting in that section, in verse 17 and following, where Jesus said, "Don't misunderstand why I've come. I did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. No, I came to," depending on your translation, "fulfill the law. I came to accomplish its purpose." We read the writings of Paul in other places. It says a big part of the purpose of the law is to lead us to Christ. Is to show us that we can't keep it. And that life is not to be found in the rules of the law, but life is to be found in God writing his law on our hearts, as the prophets foretold. God changing our hearts and then inviting us to live out of these new hearts. Well, let's walk through this quickly. The first one's about anger. Well, before we get there, remember how I said Jesus, at the end of each section, has this even more radical statement? I need to give you the example, and this would be a good time to have your Bibles open too, so you can actually see it for yourselves. Matthew chapter 5. He's talking about this. I did not come to destroy the law. I came to accomplish its purpose. And heaven and earth will, until heaven and earth disappear, not even the smallest detail of God's law will disappear until its purpose is achieved. So don't ignore it. The one who ignores it is least in the kingdom of heaven. The one who pays attention to it and teaches it will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. And in case we're yawning and miss it, he says, all right, you in the back. I'm not talking to anybody here this morning. He says, I warn you, unless your righteousness is better than the righteousness of the teachers of the religious law and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Wow, now that has our attention. That's one of those you've got to be kidding statements. Why, they pride themselves on how perfectly they live. How could I possibly be better than them? Well, he's going to tell us. Topic number 1, anger. You've heard that our ancestors were told you must not murder. Because if you murder, you're going to be subject to judgment. So what does that say about the heart? Not much. Isn't it like saying don't speed because if you get caught you have to pay a ticket? Doesn't say anything about if you're out there speeding, you're taking not only your own life in your hands, you're not only putting your own life at greater risk, but you're risking the lives of people around you. Now, does that say a little bit more about the heart? How do I regard myself? How do I regard people around me? I know now I'm afflicting the comfortable, right? Okay, I won't talk about speeding anymore. But I say to you, Jesus said, if you are even angry with someone, you are subject to judgment. He goes on to express, if you call someone an idiot, you are in danger of being brought before the court. If you curse someone, you are in danger of the fires of hell. Strong, exaggerated statements, perhaps, but if they're exaggerated to make a point. The point is, it's not enough just to refrain from killing somebody. What God cares about is the heart. And we can harbor all kinds of animosity. We can harbor all kinds of bitterness and anger towards people. And we're not pure in heart, are we? not reflecting God's heart in that way. And then verse 23, it's kind of this, okay, in case you've missed the point, he says, let me tell you how important this is. Let me tell you how much God cares about this. If you're in church and you're about ready to make your offering, if it's time for the offering to be taken, and you suddenly remember that someone has something against you, forget the offering. Now, you won't hear a preacher saying that real often, but forget the offering and go make things right. That's how important this is. In the language of the New Testament, if you're at the temple making a sacrifice, you've gone to all this trouble to get ready, and you're about to do this very important thing in your worship, in the ritual, the tradition of your worship of God, all that it represents, and there you remember someone has something against you. Leave the sacrifice. But isn't God more important? Yes. And what are we hearing of God's heart? Leave the sacrifice. Go make things right. That's how much God cares about the heart. Now, this is an interesting place where we often get things confused because it's juxtaposed, it's actually part of the topic of anger, isn't it? And so our brains do this trick, and we read that and say, okay, I'm not supposed to be angry. But if you're in church and you remember why you're angry, is that what it says? If you're there to give your offering and you remember that you have something against someone, that's what it says, isn't it? You remember why you're so angry, go settle it? It's not what it says. It says, and you remember what? Someone has something against you. See, this whole section is not about pointing fingers at other people. It's about reflecting on our own heart. You say, well, how does that relate to my anger? Well, see, we're being called to take responsibility for our actions, for our hearts. Whether it's anger that we're harboring, whether it's in worship, we recognize, we remember that there's a problem between me and another sister or brother in the faith, and that they have something against us, where we have wronged someone. See, this is taking responsibility for my heart, for my actions. It's inviting God to show me where I've been wrong, and to acknowledge that and to make it right. Verse 25 is not real dramatic. It's kind of, oh, and by the way, while I'm on this topic, it's always good to acknowledge your wrong sooner rather than later. This is not a real extreme statement, but it's a very practical one. He says, when you're on the way to court with your adversary, settle your differences quickly. And once again, it's like, okay, this is the person who made me angry and I'm taking them. No. Otherwise, your accuser. Okay, this is where you've wronged someone. If you drag your feet and if you refuse to acknowledge where you've been wronged, it's going to end up going harder for you. Going to end up handing you over to the judge, and he'll hand you over to the officer. He'll throw you in prison. You'll be there till you pay. How much better to acknowledge up front where you've been wrong, to settle with the individual and not have to go through all of that. See, the theme there is me. The theme that we're seeing here is where I'm wrong, where I've wronged someone. It's owning that. You see how that kind of flows out of the humble and some of the other characteristics of the Beatitudes? Well, I said we were going to go through this quickly, didn't I? Other topics here. We know this one very well. You've heard the commandment that says you must not commit adultery. Okay, once again, the commandment focuses on a specific action. So as long as I can keep from committing that action, as long as I can avoid having a sexual relationship with someone to whom I'm not married, then I'm doing pretty good, right? What does that say a whole lot about the heart? Not really. There's a whole lot of people who have stopped short of that action, whose hearts are not right in their relationship toward their spouse, whose hearts are not right, just period, in the whole sexual realm. Jesus says, but I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. There's that word, in his heart. The invitation comes to check our heart. And now here's this more radical statement. Okay, in case you weren't listening, let me tell you how important this is. This matter of the heart. You thought it was pretty radical saying that you should leave your gift at the altar and walk out of church and go make things right. Well, listen to this. Just so you know, if your eye, even your good eye, causes you to lust, gouge it out and throw it away. Wait a minute. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your hand, even your stronger hand, causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Exaggeration, or the fancier literary term, hyperbole, perhaps. But even hyperbole, the proper definition is exaggeration on purpose. Exaggeration for the sake of making a point. Chances are, if God enforced this, there'd be a whole lot of us here this morning who would be blind and crippled. But he invites us to take a hard look at the heart, to understand what it means to be pure in heart and what God longs for from us. The topic of vows. You've heard that our ancestors were told, you must not break your vows, you must carry out the vows made to the Lord. It's like, well, what's wrong with that? Jesus says, but I say, don't make any vows. All right, that's a little confusing. Well, understand there's a pattern here. That the religious system that grew up around the commandments of the Old Testament would see the commandments as long as I don't cross this line, I can do whatever I want around here. And they actually found very creative ways for redefining some of the lines. And so, because they developed this, and this isn't a command that says to do this, because they developed this ritual system of making vows, there was all this hierarchy of which vows were more binding than other vows. And if you swore by the temple, then that was a certain level of obligation to fulfill what you said. If you swore by God's throne or by, you understand? The heart is not, how can I be honest and trustworthy with people? The heart was, how can I work around these loopholes? It's an awful lot like a system where we say, yes, and then we go, had my fingers crossed. And we look for ways to be able to say something without being held accountable for it. You can almost feel the frustration in Jesus' voice and heart. Don't swear by anything. Who are you swear by heaven, but, that's God's throne. You don't have any business dragging God into this. You say by the earth. Well, that's his footstool. Don't even say by my head, I promise this. You can't turn one hair white or black. Just a simple yes I will or no I won't. Let your yes be yes, let your no be no. And then here comes the shocker at the end. Anything beyond this is from the evil one. All right, what's God saying about our heart? The character character of our lives. Love for our enemies. You've heard the law says, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. Now, this is interesting. The law never said, hate your enemy. Maybe people took it to that point and understood the law to give allowance for that. But Jesus said, I say, love your enemies. It's a very shocking statement. Pray for those who persecute you. In that way, you will be acting as true children of your Father in heaven. He gives us sunlight to both the evil and the good. He sends us rain on the just and the unjust alike. If you love only those who love you, what reward is there in that? Even corrupt tax collectors do that much. If you are only kind to your friends, how are you different from anyone else? Even the pagans do that. And here's the shocker. That you, if you're going to follow me, you are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Exaggeration? Perhaps. We know from other scriptures that we're not perfect and we won't be. But does that remove any accountability for the teachings of Christ here? Does that remove any accountability for taking a look, not at everybody else, but for letting the radical teachings of Jesus speak to our hearts? And to humbly open our heart to God, to the searchlight of His Spirit, and say like the psalmist, search my heart, O God. Try me, see if there be any wicked way in me. Help me to see it. And lead me in the way everlasting. This is not a heavier burden that God's putting on us. This is opening our eyes. This is revealing the truth so that it can begin to change. And that's a gift. This is really all words of comfort from the one who wants to change our heart from the inside out. The one who invites us to follow Him. Who's showing us another way of living. A radical way of living. Where the heart really does matter. But then we're free. We're free to live out of that new heart. May that be so among us.